That day, I took my granddaughter away from that toxic environment. I couldn't let her suffer like that any longer. And so, I raised Zinnia on my own for the next 10 years. We moved overseas, far away from Caspian and Emberly, and built a life together, just the two of us. 10 years later, when Zinnia and I finally returned to our home country, Caspian and Emberly came to see us. They stood at my door, smiling like nothing had ever happened. "We missed you," they said, trying to act like a loving family. "We're family after all. Let's live together." But I wasn't fooled. I looked them both in the eyes and said, "Idiots who can't appreciate their own children aren't family. Please go back." My name is Serafina, and I'm a 55-year-old widow. A few years ago, I lost my husband, and I've been living alone ever since in a large, quiet house. After my husband passed, I considered living with Caspian and Emberly, but something in my heart told me it was better to live separately. I loved my son, but there had always been tension between us, and his wife didn't make things any easier. Caspian and Emberly ran a bar, and I knew that if I lived with them, I'd likely get pulled into helping out there. I wasn't as young as I used to be, and the idea of serving customers all day didn't sit well with me. I wasn't great with people, and frankly, my body wasn't up to the task anymore. So, I chose to stay on my own, even after my husband was gone. Caspian never suggested we live together either, and I was thankful for that. I finally had some freedom after years of taking care of others. At first, living alone felt like a blessing. I no longer had to worry about caring for my husband or raising children. I thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet, but as the days passed, I realized just how lonely life could be. I had no hobbies or friends, having spent all my life focusing on my family. The silence in the house was deafening, and I spent my days watching reruns of old TV dramas, trying to pass the time. I made a few attempts to pick up new hobbies, but none of them stuck. My life felt empty. The only light in my days came from my granddaughters, Eloan and Zinnia. Eloan, the oldest, was a bright, beautiful girl, always cheerful and full of energy. Zinnia, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved, often standing in the shadow of her older sister. Eloan was always praised for being mature beyond her years, while Zinnia was often overlooked. My heart ached for her. Every time Caspian and Emberly brought the girls over to visit, Eloan would run up to me, smiling, dressed in new clothes with her hair perfectly styled. Zinnia, however, wore Eloan's old, worn-out hand-me-downs, her hair always messy and unkempt. It was clear that Zinnia was treated differently, not just by her parents, but even by Eloan. While Eloan's smile lit up the room, Zinnia's eyes were always downcast, her face clouded with sadness. She had once been a talkative, lively little girl, but over time, she had grown quieter, retreating into herself. I couldn't help but feel protective of her, even though I tried not to interfere too much in how Caspian and Emberly were raising their children. But every time they visited, my concern grew. Caspian and Emberly would dote on Eloan, showering her with attention, while Zinnia sat quietly unnoticed. Whenever I tried to speak to Zinnia, either Eloan would interrupt, or Caspian and Emberly would change the subject, completely ignoring her. One day, I decided to visit Caspian and Emberly at their house. I brought along some sweets that I knew the girls liked, hoping to spend a nice afternoon with them. As I approached the door, I heard shouting from inside. Caspian's voice echoed through the walls, filled with anger. "Why don't you say something for once instead of staying quiet all the time?" My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorbell, but before I could ring it, the door swung open. Without a second thought, I stepped inside, taking off my shoes. The shouting grew louder as I walked down the hallway, and I heard Caspian's voice again, accusingly. "You know it's your fault, right? Your silence embarrasses us." I climbed the stairs, my heart racing, and found them in a room upstairs. Caspian and Emberly were standing over Zinnia, who was sitting on the floor, her face red with tears, her cheeks swollen from being slapped. Eloan stood nearby, her hand still raised, as if she had just struck her sister. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I shoved my son and his wife aside and rushed over to Zinnia, who was sitting on the floor, hugging her tightly. Eloan stood nearby, wide-eyed, while Caspin and Emberly stared at me in shock, though they quickly regained their composure. "Mom, what are you doing? Barging in like this? You should have knocked first," Caspian snapped, clearly irritated. "That's right, Serafina. Isn't this a bit rude of you?" Emberly added, her voice laced with annoyance. I glared at both of them, my anger rising. "What's rude is what you're doing to a little girl, surrounding her like this and yelling. Caspin, you're her father. Aren't you ashamed to treat your child this way? And Eloan, why did you hit your sister?" For the first time, I raised my voice at Eloan. She looked scared at first, then dropped her head and mumbled, "Because..." Before Eloan could explain, Emberly pulled her into a tight hug, glaring at me. "Don't blame Eloan for this," she snapped, clearly protective of her older daughter. But I wasn't backing down. I met her glare with one of my own. A mother's job isn't to protect a child who's done wrong. You should be teaching her right from wrong, not defending her behavior. Caspin, who had been watching quietly, suddenly pointed at me and yelled, "Mom, what are you thinking? Get away from that idiot." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "The idiots are you and Emberly. You owe Zinnia an apology." I shouted back, "Apologize? Who's going to apologize to her?" Caspin sneered, clearly not taking my words seriously. Neither he, Emberly, nor Eloan showed any remorse. They just continued to insult Zinnia as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Zinnia, who was now in my arms, clung weakly to my clothes, her face blank and vacant, as if she had endured this treatment for far too long. Before I could even process what was happening, I scooped her up and declared, "I'm taking care of Zinnia from now on. I can't leave her in this house." Without waiting for a response, I marched out of the room, leaving them stunned. But before I could get far, Caspin followed me, a smirk plastered across his face. "Thanks, Mom. I didn't know what to do with that mute," he said casually, as if he had just solved a problem. I was speechless. My son, my own child, was treating his daughter like a burden. As I stood there, trying to comprehend his heartless words, Emberly appeared behind him, carrying a small, worn-out bag and a tattered backpack. "Here's Zinnia's stuff," she said, shoving the bags into my hands without any care. "Please take care of the rest." Both Zinnia and I stood there, speechless, staring at the faces of my son and daughter-in-law. Their expressions were cold, almost relieved that Zinnia was leaving their home. Without another word, I turned and walked away, unable to process the cruelty of the situation. When we got back to my house, I helped Zinnia take off her shoes at the door. As I looked down at her, I saw her biting her lip, trying to hold back her tears. The sight of her broke my heart, and I hugged her tightly, gently rubbing her back. "Zinnia, I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't help you sooner, but it's going to be okay now. Grandma's here, and I'm going to protect you from now on." From that day forward, Zinnia and I began living together. The damage done by her parents had taken its toll, and she stopped speaking altogether. Even the simplest words like "good morning" seemed impossible for her to say. Her teacher mentioned that she wasn't communicating at school either, not with her classmates, nor with her teachers. Worried, I took her to the hospital for a checkup. The doctors diagnosed Zinnia with selective mutism, explaining that the extreme stress she had experienced at home had caused deep-seated anxiety and fear. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak. She simply couldn't. The doctor assured me that, with time and a more nurturing environment, she would gradually regain her voice. On the way home, I bought her a notebook and a colorful pen. "Zinnia," I said, handing them to her, "if there's something you want to say but can't, write it in this notebook. You can draw pictures or write words, and maybe little by little, you can try saying the words out loud. It doesn't have to be all at once, just a little at a time, okay?" Zinnia immediately opened the notebook and started writing. After a few moments, she turned it around to show me. On the page, she had written, "Thank you, Grandma," along with a small drawing of my face. She opened her mouth, as if trying to say the words, but nothing came out. Her face fell, disappointed. I smiled and patted her head gently. "You're doing great, Zinnia. You've already taken the first step, and I'm so proud of you. One step at a time, okay? You've got this. Zinnia managed a faint smile, and from that day on, she used the notebook to communicate both at home and at school. Gradually, she started to gain confidence, and over the next 2 years, she began to speak again. Grandma, guess what happened at school today? She'd say excitedly when she came home, brimming with joy and life. Seeing her recover and thrive filled me with pride and relief. One day, I attended a parent-teacher conference at her school. As we walked into the classroom, a warm and kind teacher greeted us with a smile. "Hello, Serafina." "Hello, Zinnia," she said, welcoming us in. As we sat down, the teacher pulled out Zinnia's report card. "Her grades have improved steadily since last year," she said, showing us the chart that displayed Zinnia's academic progress. The trend was clear. She had been doing exceptionally well ever since she started living with me. I smiled proudly, patting Zinnia's head. "She's been studying so hard," I explained. "At home, she's always reading books and solving difficult problems." Since regaining her voice, Zinnia had developed a passion for learning. Every time she aced a test, she'd bring the results home with a big smile on her face, and I would hang her perfect papers on the wall. Watching her grow and succeed was the greatest reward of all. "I think it might be a good idea for Zinnia to take an IQ test at the hospital," the teacher suggested during a school meeting one day. Surprised, I asked for more details. "An IQ test? What for?" The teacher explained that Zinnia might be what they called gifted, a term used for children who possess extraordinary intelligence. According to her, Zinnia seemed to be exceptionally smart, even more so than most adults. The idea intrigued me. If Zinnia was indeed gifted, it would explain why schoolwork seemed too easy for her. The teacher thought an IQ test might help us figure out how to provide the right learning environment to nurture her talents. Without hesitation, I took Zinnia to the hospital to have the test done. As it turned out, the teacher was right. Zinnia was gifted, and her IQ was well above average. I was stunned, amazed to learn that my granddaughter possessed such an extraordinary ability. Later that day, I sat her down and asked, "How do you find school? Do you enjoy your studies?" Zinnia, with a bored expression, shrugged. "Honestly, it's too easy, and I find it boring. I want to study something more challenging, but when I try to tell the teacher, they just don't understand." Her words made me pause. I began to wonder if there was a way to challenge her mind in ways her current school couldn't. Her academic needs seemed far beyond elementary school level, perhaps even at the middle or high school level. But would Zinnia, a young girl who hadn't even graduated from elementary school yet, be able to handle such advanced studies? I consulted with her teacher again, who told me about a system in the US where students could skip grades based on their academic abilities. The teacher suggested that if we moved to America, Zinnia might have the chance to study at a level more suited to her extraordinary talents. This reminded me of my late husband's brother, who had been living and working in the US. Although I hadn't been in contact with him since my husband passed away, I decided to reach out for advice. When I explained the situation, he immediately offered his support, saying he would help us settle into life in America. Feeling relieved, I suggested the idea of studying abroad to Zinnia. She listened quietly, then smiled. "I want to go," she said, "but only if it's with you, Grandma. And I want to graduate elementary school with my friends first." Touched by her thoughtfulness, I agreed. "Of course, we'll wait until you graduate. And in the meantime, I'll work on improving my English," I told her. Zinnia's smile widened in relief. The next few months were full of happy memories. Zinnia made the most of her final year in elementary school, creating lasting friendships and enjoying her time. When she finally graduated, we exchanged contact information with her friends so they could keep in touch even after we moved overseas. I decided not to mention our plans to Caspian and Emberly. I feared they might try to take Zinnia back if they found out she was gifted, only to exploit her abilities for their own gain. Once we moved to America, Zinnia adjusted quickly. She skipped grades and threw herself into her studies with enthusiasm. I supported her in every way I could, and seeing her excitement about learning again reassured me that we had made the right decision. As time went on, Zinnia's talents truly began to shine. She not only excelled in school but eventually enrolled at Harvard University, where she studied business. Before I knew it, she had started her own company. "I want to repay you, Grandma," she often said with enthusiasm. But to me, she had already repaid me in the best way possible, by growing into a brilliant, capable, and kind-hearted young woman. Zinnia's success didn't go unnoticed. Her achievements were featured in American news outlets, and soon her name was known around the world. She became a celebrity in her own right, her story inspiring many. I often wondered what Caspian and Emberly thought of her accomplishments. Did they regret the way they had treated her? I hoped, for their sake, they did. 10 years after Zinnia started her company, we had to return to our home country for business reasons. We rented a new apartment, trying to stay under the radar. But one afternoon, the doorbell rang. Thinking it was a delivery, I opened the door without a second thought. "Mom, it's been a while. How have you been?" Caspian's voice hit me like a wave of shock. Standing beside him was Emberly, smiling in a way that made my stomach turn. I couldn't hide my surprise. "Caspian? Emberly? What are you doing here?" They ignored my confusion. Emberly, stepping closer, called into the house. "Zinnia, we've come to see you. It's your mom and dad." I quickly moved to block the door. "What do you want? Please don't come near my daughter." Caspian gave me a pitying smile. "Don't be so cold, Mom. We're still her parents. We just want to see her. That's all." "Yes, mother-in-law," Emberly chimed in. "We're family, after all. Please let us talk to her." Before I could stop them, they pushed past me and entered the house. Zinnia, hearing the commotion, peeked out from the living room. "What's going on, Grandma?" she asked. Then her eyes landed on Caspian and Emberly, and she froze, surprised. Caspian and Emberly, however, seemed thrilled to see her. "Oh, Zinnia, look at you. You've grown so much," Emberly exclaimed, reaching out to hug her, but Zinnia brushed her off coldly. "If you want to talk, we can do it in the living room." "I'll make some tea," Zinnia said, her voice icy. Without waiting for a reply, she went into the kitchen. Caspian and Emberly, unfazed, plopped down on the sofa and began reminiscing loudly, as if nothing had ever happened. Feeling uneasy, I glanced at Zinnia, who winked at me, signaling that she had everything under control. As I sat down opposite them, the conversation quickly turned to the real reason for their visit. The bar they had been running had gone under due to poor management, and Aloan, their eldest daughter, had disappeared, cutting all contact with them. Now jobless and struggling financially, Caspian and Emberly were desperate. "Zinnia, would you consider supporting us?" Caspian asked, his voice filled with desperation. "You may have left when you were little, but we raised you for 6 years. You owe us." "That's right," Emberly added, her tone pleading. "We're still your family. Let's make up for lost time. Let's live together and create new memories." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they, after everything they had done, come crawling back to Zinnia, expecting her to help them now that she was successful? Before I could say anything, Zinnia's voice cut through the tension. "Idiots aren't my family," she said, her expression calm and composed. "My only family is Grandma. Now, please leave." Caspian and Emberly stared at her in disbelief, but Zinnia stood firm, calmly walking to the door and opening it. "Goodbye." With a final click of the door lock, Caspian and Emberly were gone, slinking away in defeat. I watched them go, still in shock. But when I turned to Zinnia, she just smiled. "Grandma," she said, "how about we move?" She explained that she had been secretly planning to build a house for the two of us, designed with accessibility features to make sure I would be comfortable as I aged. I couldn't hold back my gratitude. "Thank you, Zinnia," I whispered, tears in my eyes. She just blushed and gave an embarrassed laugh. Several months later, we moved into our new home. The walls were filled with memories we had created together over the years, and even the notebook and pen we had bought when she first came to live with me were framed and on display. Every time I looked at them, I felt a deep sense of pride and love. Today, I decided to cook Zinnia's favorite dish. Smiling, I headed into the kitchen, my heart full.